There's a reason intelligent people stay in careers they've clearly outgrown. And it's not the reason most of them think. It's not fear of change, exactly. It's not laziness, or a lack of ambition, or the absence of a good enough plan. It's something more specific than any of those. And once it has a name, once the mechanism is visible, the years of confusion start to make a different kind of sense. Not the sense of, I finally know what to do. The sense of, I finally understand why doing nothing wasn't the failure I thought it was. That's where this video starts. By the end of it, you'll have a name for the specific mechanism that has been operating in your career, probably for years, without ever being introduced to you. Not a vague concept. A named, documented, observable process. One that explains why, the smarter you are, the harder this particular trap is to escape. Not despite your intelligence, but because of it. Start with what it actually feels like. Because most descriptions of this miss it. They call it burnout, or a midlife crisis, or just needing a change. And none of those names quite fit, do they? Burnout implies exhaustion from overwork. But this isn't that. You might be working hard. You're probably working well. The problem isn't the hours. It's what the hours are in service of. It's the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from working competently, consistently, often effectively, at something that stopped fitting who you are a long time ago. And here's what makes it particularly difficult to name. Because you're good at it, no one around you can see what it's costing you. Your manager sees someone who performs. Your colleagues see someone who delivers. Your family sees someone with a stable income and a clear title. And you, most days, see someone who should be grateful. But there is a moment, you've probably had it more than once, usually quiet, often at night, or on a Sunday evening, or during some unremarkable Tuesday, where you look at what you're doing, really look at it, and think, this is not what I meant to be doing. Not said with drama, just noticed, flatly. The way you notice something obvious that had been in front of you for a long time. And then, and this is the part that matters, the next thought isn't, I should leave. It's, why am I still here? That question, that's the one this video is about. Because the answer isn't what most people assume. And the assumption has been costing you something you may not have fully calculated yet. Here is what the research on this actually shows. Behavioral economists have studied what happens when intelligent, capable adults face decisions where their identity is tied to the outcome. And the pattern that keeps appearing is this. The more you understand what you've built, the harder it becomes to leave it, not because you love it. Because you know exactly what it cost. Every year of competence in this role represents something. A professional reputation carefully maintained, a salary that took time to reach, a version of stability that other people you're responsible for, depend on. And leaving isn't just a career decision. It's a decision about what all of that was for. Economists call the broader version of this status quo bias, the documented tendency to stay with a current state not because it's better, but because changing it requires accepting a loss. And the human mind, consistently, weighs losses more heavily than equivalent gains. But what's happening in a career like yours is more specific than that general pattern. It's not just that leaving feels risky. It's that leaving would produce evidence. Think about what staying actually preserves. Right now, as long as you haven't made a move in a different direction, the version of you that could make that move still exists. The person who takes the risk, who builds something different, who becomes, finally, what they thought they'd become. That version is unrealized, but it's alive. It exists as a genuine possibility. The moment you actually try in either direction, that changes. If it works, the question resolves happily. But if it doesn't, if the new direction doesn't produce what you'd hoped, if the risk doesn't pay off the way you'd imagined, then you have something you don't currently have. Permanent evidence about your own capabilities. And the smarter you are, the more precisely you can calculate what that evidence would mean. This is what behavioral researchers call protective ambiguity, the preservation of an unrealized possibility as a buffer against definitive self-knowledge. In plain language, staying keeps the dream structurally intact, not because you're naive, not because you lack courage, because you're protecting something that matters to you more than most people around you would understand if you tried to explain it. And here is what makes this specific to intelligent people. The smarter you are about risk, the more precisely you can construct the case for staying. The smarter you are about what you've built, the more you understand what losing it would actually mean. The smarter you are about yourself, the more your identity is invested in the possibility of what you could do. Intelligence doesn't dissolve this trap. It builds better walls around it. That is the mechanism. And the mechanism has a name now. The mechanism isn't neutral. It has a cost. And it's worth naming that cost with the same precision. Because the years don't just pass while you're waiting for the right moment. Something quieter is happening underneath the stability. Every year in the wrong role, a small piece of the belief in your own potential disappears. Not dramatically. Not in a single moment of crisis. Quietly, the way erosion works, through repetition, not catastrophe. At 38, you might still feel certain you could build something different if you chose to. At 42, that certainty has developed a small crack. At 45, the crack has a story attached to it. A story about the kind of person who talks about changing, but never does. And at some point, this is the moment that matters. The problem stops being about the job. It becomes about character. That shift is the most important thing to name in this video, because once the problem is about character, the trap closes completely. As long as the problem is, I'm in the wrong job, there's a solution. But once it becomes, I am someone who doesn't act on what they know, the stakes of trying become existential, because now it's not just a career that's on the line. It's the answer to the question of who you actually are. And that is a risk that no amount of career coaching, LinkedIn browsing, or productivity frameworks was ever designed to help you navigate. That's why it didn't work before. Not because you lacked the information. Because you were playing a different game than the advice assumed. Here is the reframe this video is built around. The paralysis is not the problem. The paralysis is information. It is a completely logical, documented, observable response to a situation where the stakes of acting have quietly become about identity, rather than just career. You were not failing to act out of weakness. You were doing something specific and rational, preserving a possibility that felt more important than most people around you understood. The mechanism has a name now, and named things are navigable in ways that unnamed things are not. Before moving into what actually interrupts this mechanism, there's something in the description worth knowing about. It's a short quiz, 5 minutes, designed to tell you which specific type of stuck you're actually in. Because burnout and genuine misalignment look similar from the outside, but they respond to completely different moves. And knowing which one you're dealing with changes everything about where to go next. The link is in the description. It takes 5 minutes and produces a specific result, not a generic score, but a named picture of your situation. If this video opens something you want to make more specific to you, that's where to go. So, what actually interrupts this? Not bravery, not a crisis that forces the decision, not a morning when you finally feel ready. Because that morning, for most people in this situation, never arrives on its own. What interrupts the mechanism is something considerably less dramatic than any of that. It's the moment the decision stops being about identity and returns to being about information. The moment you stop asking, am I the kind of person who can do this, and start asking, what would I need to know to take the next smallest step without betting everything? Those are different questions, and they produce completely different answers. Here is what the research on career transition actually shows, as distinct from what the career coaching industry tends to say. The people who navigate this successfully, people with real financial obligations, with mortgages and dependents, and partners whose income is part of the calculation, almost none of them made a leap. They made a series of small, deliberate, low-risk moves that each produced information. Not a plan so perfect it neutralized all risk before they started. Not a moment of courage so complete it made the fear irrelevant. A move, then another move, then a third, each one informed by the previous. The controlled exit isn't a strategy for people who have nothing to lose. It's the only strategy that actually works for people who have everything to lose. And the first move is almost never what people expect. It's not updating your resume. It's not networking. It's not taking a course in the new direction. The first move is understanding the mechanism that's been operating, which is what this video has been doing. Because you cannot interrupt something you cannot see. You now have a name for the specific dynamic that has been holding this in place. Not a vague sense that you're stuck. A specific, documented, named mechanism, status quo bias, amplified by identity investment, sustained by protective ambiguity, that intelligent, capable adults experience at higher intensity than most career advice ever accounts for. That name is not a small thing. The years you've spent in the wrong role were not wasted years. They are the reason you have the judgment to know it's wrong. They are the reason you have something real to offer in whatever comes next. Not in spite of the detour, but because of what the detour built. And the path forward from here does not require betting everything. It requires understanding the mechanism, which you now do, and taking the first small step that doesn't require burning the door you came through. That is what a controlled exit actually looks like. Not someone else's version of it. Yours. If what's in this video opens something you want to make specific to your situation, the quiz in the description takes 5 minutes and tells you exactly which type of stuck you're dealing with. That distinction changes what the next move actually is. Link is in the description and in the pinned comment. What was the moment you realized this had stopped being about the job and had become about something bigger than that? You came to this video with a question you've probably been carrying for a while. Not the surface question, not should I leave. You've been asking that one long enough to know it doesn't produce an answer on its own. The real question underneath it, why haven't I? And the answer most people give themselves. The one that arrives quietly in the space between performance reviews and Sunday evenings and LinkedIn scrolling is a story about character. About being someone who talks about changing but never does. I want to offer a different answer. Not as comfort. As a more accurate description of what has actually been happening. You were not failing to act. You were doing something specific. Preserving a possibility that felt more important to you than most people around you would understand. The mechanism has a name now. Status quo bias, intensified by intelligence. Protective ambiguity, sustained by identity investment. A completely rational, documented response to a situation where the stakes quietly became about who you are, not just what you do. That is not a character flaw. That is a mechanism. And mechanisms, once visible, can be interrupted. The person who clicked play on this video and the person finishing it are not in exactly the same place. Something shifted, even slightly. The confusion has a name now. The years of inaction have an explanation that isn't about weakness or insufficient desire or a failure of the ambitious self you thought you'd be. You were right about what you were capable of. You were just working against a mechanism that had no name. It has one now. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, exactly how this begins. Not in a leap. In the moment the mechanism becomes visible, you now have that. What comes next is yours to decide. And this channel exists to help you decide it carefully.